Today is Friday, April 14, 2023, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. I'm here on a rainy spring day with my podcast co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. How are we doing today, Mr. Smith?
We're doing fantastic, Mr. Robinson. It's great to be here. I love a rainy day, and it's rainy, and I'm digging it.
I would live in Southern California. I don't need the rain.
How many people are going to get that song? It never rains in Southern California. You know, song. Yeah. No, I like it.
So, what do we have on tap for today?
Well, today, and I think you would agree with me, this is partially spurred, I think, by some passages we heard Mr. Weston refer to just recently in a sermon. Was it the high day that we just finished? End of unleavened bread? I can't remember, but Roman. It wasn't.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think it was. Romans 1 is on our mind. In particular, what Romans 1 has to say about, frankly, the direction our culture is going, the mental processes that younger people are being sucked into as they get caught up in this whirlpool, which the Apostle Paul specifically says is exactly what would happen to your culture and to your mind. So we are going to talk about Romans 1, verses 18 through 32, and what does that have to do with you?
Sounds good. Let's break it down.
Welcome back, and love that music from Jake and Julia. I appreciate, even now, here we are. We're pretty deep into our second season, Mr. Robinson. This is the 50th episode we've done, and
It's kind of amazing.
It is, and we still just have the Smith and Robinson music. We haven't done anything to add the name of the podcast to it, because when we started this, we didn't even know what the name of the podcast was going to be. But I got to admit, I love the jingle. Still do.
No.
Still appreciate they did that.
You and I, both when we record the intro before we get into the main body, and then at the conclusion, we both at times hear the jingle rising in our in our
right.
mind as it's time,
That's right.
time to play it.
And you mentioned earlier during the little break where we'll be putting the music in there that you might want to clarify your comments about rain.
Right.
You're not anti-rain,
No,
Mr. Robinson?
I'm not anti-rain. In fact, if I live in a climate that's generally sunny, the odd days that come in that are rainy, even several in a row, or actually can be quite enjoyable. I think probably rather what I mean is a climate where there was a lot of off and on rain would probably get to me over time. A lot of gray, a lot of rain.
Yes.
There are areas of our country like that.
Yeah, there are, and maybe that I should qualify mine too. Part of why I enjoy really good rain is that I've lived places where you just don't get it very often, and I have to admit, what I get tired of is too long stretches before big thunderstorms. I just love big thunderstorms, and I feel like you don't get enough of those. But yeah, if I lived in some area where it's that all the time, and we have been through some stretches where it just seemed like it was rain day after day after day, and it does start to feel oppressive after a while.
Well, my father-in-law, who died 16 years ago, I think, he's from Oregon, and we went there for the feast. And we came back. We're like, oh, it was really nice, and it didn't rain too much. And he's like, that's not how it is normally. He's like, it's not sunny like that. He did not miss Oregon at all.
Oh, that's funny. Oh, nothing against you folks there in Oregon, but we all have our
most people don't
specializations.
realize. Sorry, I'm talking.
No, do it.
Oregon is divided into two very distinct styles. The
really?
East of the Cascades is sort of like you would think like. Vancouver, British Columbia, like a wet tropical forest kind of style. But once you get over the Cascades to get on the other side is the high desert. And it's much sunnier on that side relative to, I guess the weather gets kind of trapped in the Cascades a little bit and keeps that area warmer but wetter.
Okay. Well, we enjoyed the half of our feast we spent in Oregon this last feast, and but it was along the coast, and part of the climate and such that we don't normally get to see.
I'm now preparing myself from all the email from the people from Oregon letting me know just how wrong I am about their environment.
Just email Mr. Robinson at podcast@livingyouth.org. So, all right, let's jump. In fact, let me go ahead and say that one more time. If you actually don't just want to yell at Mr. Robinson, but also want to suggest some ideas for the podcast, that is the email address, podcast@livingyouth.org.
We haven't taken all of them because occasionally some of the suggestions are a little too narrow for a podcast and some aren't exactly fit what we want, but we've done quite a number of the podcasts that are based on to some degree on feedback we've gotten from the audience.
We've really appreciated the feedback, and sometimes they're just small enough that that we can't use them in the podcast. Sometimes they're actually too broad too. It's like, wow, that's really huge. Sometimes we just want to say, hey, that's a great question for your pastor. But at the same time, you guys have really gotten those ideas in. We've really appreciated that, and your feedback. Let me say this: if some of you think the podcast really stinks, you haven't bothered to mail us and tell us. So I guess thank you for that.
True.
I guess
that's true. Yes, keep up the work, everyone.
That's right. That's right. So, well, today's note. The theme of this podcast, we've said before, is thinking biblically, trying to teach you, trying to model for you, really, a better way to put it, if you're a teen in God's church, if you're a young adult, trying to model biblical thinking. And I think it was in Mr. Weston's sermon recently. He just really gave a fantastic sermon for the last day of unleavened bread. And I think it was that one. If not, it might have been a different one, but I just remember him talking about it. It just brought to my attention, I know, Romans chapter 1, in this particular passage where Paul, you talk about biblical thinking, Paul addresses the idea that choices and sin, you're impacted by what you want to believe, not just what you're convinced of, but what you want to believe, what you don't want to believe. And some people, believe it or not, want to believe a lie. In fact, we can all have a tendency to be drawn toward a convenient lie. And those things have an impact on you and on what you think. And then this particular passage we're going to cover today kind of hits a real, I don't know how to word it, but at the very last verse, there's like a twist. And that twist, I think, is vital to understand in our day and age. And in particular, if you're young, I heard it literally this morning on a podcast I was listening to as I drove into the office here. You have a lot of people. It was actually someone commenting on the trans ideology in general concerning, transgender issues and whether a man actually can be a woman just because he believes that he's a woman, whether that actually makes him a woman or not, and vice versa. And the commentator made a strong statement, but I do think at its heart it is correct. He was saying that really, unless you were born after, say, 2005 or so, I think he's somewhere around there, there's no way you actually believe this ideology.
Right.
Deep down, it is actually not true. And he highlighted that's part of why the culture warriors that are trying to make these perverted ideas an institutional a permanent institution. That's why they're aiming so much at younger people, because you're still forming ideas, you're still putting thoughts in place, and they're doing their best to convince people, human beings at a younger and younger age, that these perverted falsehoods are actually true. Because if you can plant those seeds early enough, it just sets in and it sticks. And so I really believe this particular passage in Romans chapter 1 is of utmost importance, and your ages are a mixture of some of the ages that are pressing for these things in society, but also the target of those who seek to capture your mind about these things. So the plan is we're going to read through Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through, actually the last verse, 32. We're just going to read a few verses and then comment on them. Is that still the plan, Mr. Robinson? Is that what you think of as the plan? Mm-hmm. Okay. I guess we could take turns. I didn't really think about it, but the plan is we haven't planned that much in advance. We're going to read a few verses, and then we're going to comment on them. So I've got the verses parsed for us, and if we ever need to differ from this, Mr. Robinson, we certainly can.
Oh, it looks good.
Looks good. How about, I'll go ahead and start since I guys going on Romans chapter 1. So let's start in Romans chapter 1, verse 18. Here, Paul introduces the whole idea, and it's difficult because things kind of get overlapped here and there, and he'll talk about things more than once, and so I'm going to do my best to save some comments maybe for later statements. But in Romans 1 and verse 18, Paul warns all of us, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." Any thoughts on that particular passage, Mr. Robinson?
Well, I have several. So, do you remember? In fact, I went back to double check that I had all my facts right. But you remember Ben Stein's what would you call that?
Oh, the little movie
Yeah,
documentary.
documentary
Yes.
called Expelled.
Yes, I do
No
remember that.
Intelligence Allowed. And I thought he did a really good job, actually, of cataloging and highlighting how if you're in the scientific community and you want to research things along the lines of, the origin of the universe and where did things come from, well, if you want any funding, we're not going to talk about intelligent design.
Yes.
Any idea that there's something approaching a god or an incredible intelligence that's guided what we see now, forget about it. We're not interested in that kind of research. And what's ironic about that is the more we've learned, and I've been listening to a lot of podcasts over the last few years. I mentioned recently the Andrew Huberman podcast, and he's just like weighing on the biology of how our brain works. We know a lot about it. And every day, every week that goes by, there's just more and more confirmation of how much design there is, how much intelligence there is, and that we you could argue that there's a segment of the scientific community that actively does not want that to be the case and spins it a certain way, or, as Paul has pointed out here, suppresses the truth because if there is an intelligent designer, or, God, you might find out what else he might have on his mind or what he's saying, because it eventually, to me, the progression always was, well, if you believe there's a God, well, what does God have to say? And if what does God have to say, it starts to have an element of morality in it. That's kind of fundamentally what we reject. And I would argue the main reason humanity wants to reject God is because of all the various inconvenient truths and the guidelines around how we should live our lives. We don't want those restrictions. In fact, some of the people that you and I have listened to, we listen to some different ones and some overlap, is there's this real war on normalcy, or,
Yes.
just like we don't want to have any restriction at all. So much so that author Mary Harrington in one of her pieces talked about how we want to use technology to even change things like that mothers bond with their child. Oh, with technology and training, we could end that and have the men do that. And it's just
crazy.
It's the end of even the most basic elements of our biology and creation we want to have no restriction on.
One of our writers for the Tomorrow's World magazine, honestly, an amazing writer and a handsome fellow.
Yeah, I think quite skilled at arithmetic as well.
Sometimes does podcasts. Yeah, okay, it's me. I'm just kidding. I'm not that handsome. But yeah, the article I wrote, The War Against Normal, that was exactly my mindset. It's like whatever is normal, there's a desire to get away from that, because the more you recognize something as normal, the more it restricts you to an expectation of behavior. And that's going to kind of lead us into a bit of the next passage. So I'll jump right to that. Other than to just first capitalize on what you're saying, you're exactly right. I thought that was actually a very good documentary, the Expelled documentary. It's a little old now and might be dated, but if you haven't seen it, it's worth seeing. You can't... It's interesting. One of the pushbacks that evolutionists will give concerning intelligent design and the idea that God is a creator is they'll say, "Oh, well, how many published peer-reviewed papers talk about that?" Well, actually, there are some, but still, in fact, even if you read their papers carefully, you'll actually see the design that's present. But then what they don't talk about is how they act as gatekeepers, so that if a paper does lean in that direction, they will push hard against it. And you haven't seen academic wrath until you've seen one of these papers actually make it through the process and no one noticed the implications because it was a good scientific paper, and then they discovered afterwards, and they will actually attack the individuals that allowed that paper to get through.
Well, I have another example of that. You and I talked about earlier this year, there is a tremendous amount of evidence of a worldwide universal flood, a tremendous amount. Now, it's hard to tell what was a universal flood and what was when the sea levels rose, which also is widely accepted that the sea levels rose about 300 or 400 feet. I would argue the Bible highlights that after the flood, Peleg is tied with that because it says, I just heard this recently. Was it in Chronicles? I think it might have been in Chronicles. First Chronicles, when it's going through a rather extensive genealogy, Peleg, because in his days the waters rose and cut off all those the little peninsulas that connected Asia, North America up in Alaska. There's lots of water bridges that are underwater now. I mean, you used to be able to walk all the way from Australia to New Zealand, from what I understand. maybe I'm mixing up some of my data points, but the larger point is a tremendous amount of evidence of a universal worldwide flood. And guess what? A lot of established scientists don't want to talk about that, and they will fight your paper.
Yeah, that's part of the challenge. The same thing we face in the church. As literally talking to Mr. Weston about this 2-3 days ago, I think it was before the Holy Day, is take a look at young Earth creationists, which we are not.
Mm-hmm.
Their position is so extreme that because having to be forced to defend such an extreme position, they actually do uncover worthwhile things. They uncover things that help to document how evolution is a fraud, how it's not true, but they also are so pressed they come up with things that are completely bonkers as well, right? And so you have guys, you have to have this open mind to have discovered things, but at the same time, no one is completely guided well, and there's so much evidence that people do not want to address. And it is that unwillingness to address the evidence that Paul is focusing on. So he's talking about them suppressing the truth, and then and saying they have no excuse. It says at the end of verse 20, and that leads us into the next passage. He says in verse 21, because although they knew God, now what does that mean? It doesn't mean they knew the fullness of his revelation. It means that they recognize he does exist. I'm in a world in which I have to admit there's evidence of a divine being who designed all of this. It says again in verse 21, because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. It's getting into, idolatry here, but setting the creation above God, as if we don't need a God, we have the creation. The creation is sufficient. And if you look at evolution, that's kind of what you're saying. With evolution, you're essentially declaring to the world, especially if you fold into it origin of life issues that don't have any kind of God involved. We believe the creation is sufficient to create itself, to organize itself, to bring itself into being. And like it says right there at the very beginning, they have to recognize the evidence. It says, like I said in verse 19, what may be known of God is manifest in them, but they chose not to glorify him as God. They see the evidence, but they reject it. They're not thankful that there is a God. It's the opposite. They don't want to have a God, as other verses will make astonishingly clear. And because of that, what is the result? It says at the end of verse 21, their hearts were darkened because of that. God is the source of light and understanding in the world. And if you actively choose to turn against that light, you don't want that in your life, well, then what's left if you don't want light? You have darkness. And as a result, in verse 22, it says, professing to be wise, they became fools. And we have to emphasize in this culture, that doesn't mean uneducated. That doesn't mean not credentialed up to the top of your head, PhDs and whatever it is, whatever letters you can put after your name. It doesn't mean that they don't have a vast amount of education. You're not talking about, people have confused education with actual knowledge and wisdom, and it's not the same thing. You can have very intelligent people filled with many fascinating facts, and yet the Bible says if you're not willing to recognize God as he has made himself abundantly available to be known to you in the world, your heart will become darkened, and even as you profess your wisdom, you will absolutely be a fool.
I think it's real key in this section to recognize that Paul is laying out a formula. When we get down to verse 24 and 25, I would even add to that, but I'll wait until we get down there. But Paul's developing this argument, if you will, that has a logical conclusion, which is that, again, verse 24 and 25 will bring this out. It's like God is the creator of everything. The attributes of his character and his creation are embedded within the creation itself. I mean, what do we talk about the privileged planet that we're in this location where we can observe the galaxy around us, which is kind of amazing. And so, but once we reject that and become unwilling to accept the truth around us from God's creation, it sets us on this path of a slow or sometimes perhaps speedy descent into lawlessness, which results in perversion, and you become blinded to it, to where you're not even aware. A certain lack of awareness is lost. If we'll have time, Again, there's a word in here that ties in additionally to Second Thessalonians, where again it talks about God sending strong delusion on mankind at the end. So I think that's all I would add to that. There's that word futile. I actually have a definition of it here because it was kind of interesting what its more complete meaning is. The Greek word there that we translate futile into English is to fall into religious error, to be perverted, to become vain.
Wow.
So, I had a section of this I covered in one of my split sermons, and you just see this pattern. Once this foolishness and blindness sets in, immorality follows, and that's where Paul's going to go next in the rest of Romans.
Wow. By the way, thank you for saying futile. I can tell you every time I read that word, I struggle. Is it futile? Futile? You look it up, and it's both. Just so you know, both are acceptable pronunciations, and for some reason, I never feel comfortable with either one.
Interesting. I didn't even realize I said futile until
you did. I actually kind of like it better. What I wish I could remember, brief geek break, is when Jean-Luc Picard becomes part of the Borg, and he's been taken over, and he's talking to the rest of the Enterprise, and he's repeating the line the Borg have: resistance is, I think they say futile. I think they say futile. Resistance is futile.
I think they say futile.
Do they say futile?
I think so.
Well, I don't want to talk like the Borg, man. I want to go back to futile.
They were pretty successful.
Okay. You did. All right, here we go. Romans 1 and verse 24. Let's continue. Because you're exactly right. It's difficult because, man, you really want to go on some of these things, but you realize he actually has even tighter statements of it later in the passage here and there. So in verse 24, starting here, we'll read the next two verses. Romans 1, verse 24. Therefore, I got to give it to Mr. Ken Frank. Mr. Ken Frank has this wonderful gimmick about when he says a therefore. He says, whenever you see a therefore in the Bible, ask yourself, what's it there for? What's the whole point? So understand what's the context leading to verse 24. It is that you have people that have all the evidence. Their deep lizard brain has to recognize God exists. There is I say lizard brain. I don't believe in evolution, but the deepest parts of them recognize God is present in this creation. The evidence is all there, but I don't want that. I reject that. In fact, if someone's going to bring it up, I'm going to do my best to put it down so other people don't have it. So therefore, what is the result of this thinking, this darkening of the hearts? Verse 24, therefore, God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lusts of their hearts to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. So the result of this thinking, of actively deciding, I don't want to admit that God exists. I don't even want to have that in my life. I'm going to shove that away and avoid it in all my thoughts. Your heart becomes darkened, and God gives them up to uncleanness. And then the lust of their flesh, they just dishonor their bodies amongst themselves.
So I have another translation there that I like because it just puts a fine point on verse 25. And this is NLT, New Living Translation, second edition. Says, they traded the truth about God for a lie. So they worshipped and served the things God created instead of the Creator himself.
That's a great way to put it.
I think that's really on point because what's interesting about verse 25 there is, at least in this case, it's referring to actually a specific lie, like a key lie, like the most fundamental lie of all. And as Mr. McNair, in his sermon on the last day of unleavened bread.
Oh, Mr. Rod McNair, that was excellent.
Rod McNair, he, that was good. He talked about, hey, when did we start redefining truth? Was it in the last 10 years, 20 years? And then he rightly takes us all the way back to Genesis 3, which was the origin of trading out the truth for the lie. That when we reached and took from the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, we decided we would decide for ourselves. Satan had sold us on the lie that we could be like God and make the decision for ourselves. And God says, well, the truth is that's not going to happen. Yeah. So we traded in our God, the Creator, as the truth and who we worship, for essentially worshiping ourselves and our own ideas in some sense. You could also give Satan a lot of credit for that. There's a worship of him in there in time, whether through ignorance or not.
I think that's part of his deception is making you think you can just worship yourself, when in the reality, no, that's you're serving him in that regard.
So I think that's what Paul is highlighting there, is that there's a very core fundamental lie at work, which is, I would argue, that's commandment number one. Only God can be worshipped. Every other idol. And why? This is because I've got into this quite a bit. There's a psalm, which I probably don't have recorded, that makes it quite clear that what's the problem with idols fundamentally? Well, you become like what you worship.
Right.
That's the bottom line. So if we worship anything, no matter how seemingly good it might be or how good and edifying we think it is, if it's not God and his truth, we'll slowly drift away and follow a different idea, which always ends the same way.
No, it does. Mr. Raminair did. I thought it was really artful the way he did it. And like we can talk about, say, the whole transgender ideology. Oh, we're redefining man and woman. Well, his point was we've constantly redefined sin. We've declared something not to be sinful when it is. But then when did that really start? He goes back and talks about how, gender was changed, sex was changed, marriage was changed. You go back and you trace it all the way back. And it really does start with Adam and Eve. And what I think, if you look at what they did, tempted by the devil, Eve was deceived by the devil. Adam was not deceived, but chose to go ahead and go that direction anyway. They chose it, and I tend to say this, and it's not wrong, but I feel like there's a broader picture it's easy to miss. They chose for themselves at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil by taking that fruit when God said not to decide right and wrong for themselves. There is a right and wrong, but they said, hey, God, instead of what you say, we're going to decide what's right and wrong. But fundamentally, right and wrong isn't really a choice. Right and wrong is a reflection of God's own character and morality, which is eternal and perfect and fixed. Right and wrong, it's not like there's reality and right and wrong is something imposed on reality. When you recognize that right and wrong is inherent to God's own character and nature, and God's own character and nature defines what is reality, then denying right and wrong from the beginning was essentially a denying of reality, a denying of all of nature. And from that point on, you are utterly unmoored and you can't predict where things are going to go. Well, but God does. He predicts where they're going to go. And they're going to go into the direction this culture actually has. So as he mentions here, what's the result? You give yourself up to uncleanness. If the creation around you, the physical world, is the pinnacle of all things, and so what do you see people just indulging in the creation? That's all that matters to them. And the fact is, creation is malleable. You don't like two rocks next to each other, you can stack one on top of the other. You don't like your body the way it is, you can carve it up and cut it up and inject something in it and change it into something else.
Well, we're 10 years into a hideous experiment on whether or not we could change our gender. And a lot of people are paying a heavy price for that. I appreciated the point you made that say maybe before 2005, you're not really going for this whole that you could be a different gender thing. If you've been around a woman long enough, look, it's problematic enough for us as married men who've been married to our wives for almost 30 years to always know what to do in the right situation because there's just a feminine approach. And I see these guys that start dressing like a woman and they start saying that they're a woman. I was like, you don't have a clue as to what's going on with a woman and what's important to her and what's not and what motivates them and what worries them. You're thinking like a man. I don't care what you've done to reshape your body. You're a man. You haven't changed your fundamental ideology and your approach. Like you and I have talked about many times. This is very early on in the debate when Ben Shapiro was on with a group of guys and he was sitting next to this trans guy who was a big guy.
Actually, and by the way, you got to define, he actually was a guy.
Yeah.
Trans guy, we're saying a guy who identified as a woman, right?
Yeah. I'm kind of old school in my references.
No, it's right. That's good.
And Ben calls them out on it. He does in this case, he does a fantastic job. There's other areas where I don't agree with Ben's approach to life. But in this case, Ben Shapiro was just a logical person. And so, like all women, this trans man decided the best avenue was to actually threaten Ben Shapiro with physical violence if he didn't agree with his thought. And I was like, just like every woman would.
Right. This trans-identifying man, he was a man who identifies as a woman. If you haven't seen the clip, he literally grabs Shapiro behind the neck with his massive man hand.
Yeah.
And tells him essentially, because I think Shapiro was saying things like "sir" here and there or something.
Oh, yeah.
And he essentially tells him, if you do that again, you're going into a hospital. most feminine thing you could ever do.
Exactly.
I've never seen a woman anywhere,
I've
do
constantly
something
been accosted
like
by
that.
women threatening me with physical violence.
Yeah, it really is. So what happens is you decide that there is no God. You eject God from the world. You've actually ejected from the world of your mind the only ground of actual reality. And now you are living a lie in every capacity, and you can't control where that lie is going to break in and ruin any other new part of your reality.
I'll just make one more final comment so that we can actually buttress our position with actual biological facts from people who are not religious in nature. There is a professor of evolutionary mating habits. So basically, just think, hey, how have historically different cultures approached men and women and mating and all these kinds of different things? And he said on a podcast I heard one time, he said, well, I'll put it to you like this. Nowhere in the anthropological record do we have any instance of a group of women attacking another city full of women to take all the men away back to their city.
It's only in stupid fantasy things, Amazonian, this and that. There's a reason all that is fantasy, because it's absolutely not reality.
Well, I would argue, I know we're kind of getting closer to the end of our section, but you talked about therefore, which that was, I don't know where I first heard that, but that was a real game changer for me.
With first time I heard it was Mr. Frank. I loved it.
It's not fair to call Paul a series of digressions. That's not right. But he builds complex ideas off of, okay, so we've summarized this, therefore, right. Okay, I need to keep all the previous context in mind. But there's even an amen there at the end of verse 23.
Oh, there is. You're right.
So it's kind of a conclusion of a thought, but then he launches in to verse 26, more conclusion based on this. For this reason, God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged their natural use for what is against nature. Likewise, all men, leaving the natural use of the women, burned in their lust for one another, men with men, committing what is shameful and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error, which was due. So I make one comment here, and then I should really turn it over to you. Verse 26, God gave them, there's a point at which you actually have your conscience seared. I think Paul says this a little later here in Romans. And at a certain point, God kind of just gives you over to your debased mind. But the thing that was interesting to me was, again, that same word for the lie is in Thessalonians, as I mentioned earlier, which is just more, you put these scriptures together, which paint a really pretty vivid picture of what's going to be happening in the end time. And you see a massive humanity blinded by foolish, stupid ideas about what, I don't know, how do you want to define that? But it's nowhere near what the truth is, and God kind of lets us go with that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I would say that I wonder if in some things, God clearly allows the sin of some people to reach a maximum, right? It's as if He hasn't. In some cases, people have gone so far. If you look historically and what it kind of indicates in the Bible, where there's just no restraint on this people. They're just headed towards this climax. And it doesn't have to mean that they are irretrievably reprobate, I don't think. I think many of them will come up in the second resurrection and have an opportunity to have their brains healed, have their circuitry rewired, at least to be shown how they got to be in that place. And I do wonder sometimes if God, almost as a mercy, just allows someone to go because they're so busy. Like I've known some that are so plagued, say, by the idea of I don't know, keeping the Sabbath, say, that they give into the temptation. They don't really choose to keep the Sabbath, and at a certain point, it's almost like God actually does. It says in Romans with the Jews of that day, just allow them to be blinded and go on, because you risk irreparably damaging yourself versus, if you do come to yourself later, if God mercifully opens your eyes again, regrettably, you're going to have baggage you will always, always, always regret. And yet, it's like potentially the better outcome versus completely, callousing yourself, against the things, because that's the environment he's talking about here in Romans 1, is someone who's actively choosing. They don't, in fact, it literally says it in the verse that's about to come up next. But I should highlight in this passage, verses 26 and 27, it is unavoidable. I say it's unavoidable. theologians, quote unquote, in the world will bend themselves into pretzel knots to avoid the conclusions of verses 26 and 27. That is, their clear statements. But homosexuality is a sin. It is a vile passion. It says literally in verse 26, speaking of men being, following in their lust towards other men, women doing the same. It says burning in their lust. It calls that in verse 26 a vile passion. It says in verse 26 what is against nature. It says in verse 27 it is shameful. There's no getting around these passages. I read something just the other day, and I've seen some of these fellows at the NRB where they're homosexuals, but they're doing their best to convince the world that you can actually be a Christian, a follower of Christ, and a practicing homosexual at the same time. And they have to go through such knots on passages like this because it's absolutely inconceivable. God knows what he made to be nature. Now, people will point at certain chimpanzees, right? They'll point, well, look at these animals over there. They behave in this way. And yeah, it's kind of funny if you also say, hey, and here's some animals eating their own young. I guess that's something okay too. Talk about warfare. Oh, we got to be against war. They're actually discovering now chimps go to war. Essentially, they will actually band up against each other, and they will go to war. It's like, deep down, people don't really care if they can find it in the animal world or not. All they want to do is justify what they want to do. When the Bible is talking about what's natural here, it's talking about what God designed to be. And it's clear that homosexuality is against what God designed to be. It is a vile passion. And consequently, it is to be avoided in every way. And as we'll see in the wrap-up verse later on, there's danger in even approving of those who do such things. I have to highlight, it doesn't mean we hate those people. It's actually the opposite of that. And this verse brings that out. At the end of verse 27, it talks about those who do those things. It says, the end of verse 27, they receive in themselves the penalty of their error, which was due. We don't need to go into all the details, but there is tons of evidence that those lifestyles are fundamentally damaging to a person. They're not the way God designed you to be. And this is a difficult world. You do have people who are in that place where they're feeling, say, homosexual temptations, and they don't even know how they came to that place. Well, it's kind of easy to understand in one way. Dr. James Dobson talks about some things that can happen early in childhood. You also now live in a culture that virtually celebrates this at every corner, and after a while, swimming upstream starts to get a little tiring. So you might find yourself, say, in that place, but there are natural consequences to those things. That's part of what God's talking about here. There is a penalty in life that just like there's a penalty to deciding to walk out into the street without looking both ways. Eventually, something's going to happen. When we in God's church preach against these lifestyles and sins, it is absolutely not because of anything hateful. It's because when you love your brother or sister, when you love your fellow human, you don't want them to go in those directions. You want them to pull themselves back. You want to extend a hand and help them away from those things. Just like you would if you saw someone getting caught up in drug addiction or alcohol abuse or anything like that. You would want them not to go down that road. So why do we talk about these things? Well, one, you can't tell me the world isn't talking about these things, because the world is talking about it more than it ever has before. I can't go into a Target or anything and not see a rainbow flag staring me in the face. And yet the Bible says, you know what? That's a terrible direction to go in life. I didn't make you for that, and it's going to harm you. Please don't do that. And so we would actually be doing wrong by our fellow man not to preach about these things and not to preach, please do not go that way. There is destruction down that path. Please take another path. So that's why we talk about these things. It's not out of being mean. It's not out of being hateful. It's because we love our fellow man. Reality is reality, and part of this passage here is about avoiding reality and the consequences of it, and that's just the way it is. In fact, verse 28 gets into perhaps the most blatant statement of the mindset that's being talked about. In Romans 1, verse 28, it just says straight up front, And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting. That's it. They could have retained God in their knowledge. They're exposed to him in creation, the fact of right and wrong, that it really isn't arbitrary. There's so much evidence we have concerning the existence of a power that is greater than us, but they did not like to retain that. They actively did not want it. So God said, fine, debased mind for you. The fact is, sin is generally connected to a debasing of the mind. It might be in subtle ways, it might be in powerful ways, but if you want a solid, clear-thinking mind, you're not going to have that apart from a foundation in the existence of God, not fully and not truly. You know, the Bible says wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord. Knowledge begins with the fear of the Lord. That has to be your starting place.
So, do you want to read through verse 32?
Yeah, we could go all the way to verse 32 at this point, I think.
Well, since that's the end of the section.
Yeah, we're really here at this. So what happens when, let's see, it says, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting. What is the result in society? Verses 29 and 30 tell us, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, which I think is one of the most interesting description. They just come up with new evil things, right? They're not content with the evil things they have. They come up with new ones.
Well, I mean, that's what it feels like.
It does.
The news cycle feels like, what new terrible, wicked thing have we come up with this week?
That's right. It continues, disobedient to parents. You know, that's been celebrated in our culture for decades at this point, but that's included in when you're in a society that is falling apart and debased. You see disobedience to parents. Verse 31, undiscerning. We see so much lack of discernment now. Untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful. And I would say we are living in a world that utterly lacks mercy. And we get to the kicker in verse 32, the end of the passage, talks about all these individuals and says, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, and I would say some of these individuals, I feel like at least in some, you can kind of tell that they are raging against a certain kind of judgment that they sense in their hearts is due to a certain extent, at least in some I've seen. I'm not saying all of them for sure. But anyway, who knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death. And I can almost feel the spirit of Tom Turner making sure I know that's not us to deliver. We don't deliver death. All of us have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and all of us in that sense have earned death. And yet there was a reason some of these things you're seeing in the Old Covenant, God would ensure those who committed such things were to die because he did not want those things spreading in that community. These were civilization-killing things. And so please keep that in mind. There's the things God takes very seriously, and that's what Paul is saying here. But to wrap it up, he says, not only do the same, that is, there's those who do these things, but also approve of those who practice them. And that's the real kicker. It's not just that it is terrible and mind-destroying and condemned by God to practice these things, but also it's like, oh, that's not for me, but hey, live and let live. I think that's fine if they want to do that. No, God condemns even approving those who practice them.
Somebody brought out some years ago that the LGBTQ plus and all the other letters, that one of the letters, or maybe it was even the plus, stood for allies. So not necessarily gay or bi or any of these things and what we would think of as heteronormative, but was supportive of their cause are considered allies. And Paul makes it pretty clear you do not want to be an ally. And I mean, just think about the ways he just described these behaviors and how far away from God they are. And so that we just need to be very careful and cautious as we approach the world, that we don't even just inadvertently support a cause that is fundamentally anti-God.
100%. The world is very good at making it seem tempting. And they'll throw up so many irrational, irrelevant arguments to say, well, I know couples that are heterosexual and they're married and they have kids, but they're terrible. They abuse their kids and they're awful. And you bet that is who's saying that's good? Nobody is saying that that's good. But what does that have to do with what's at hand? Does that change anything about the other? No, it doesn't change anything at all. God warns against getting caught up in not just these things themselves, but a spirit that approves these things. And I would say that's probably most of society, at least around us these days. In fact, used to be the people that were strongly pushing against, say, legal recognition of same-sex quote-unquote marriage. Now that is so broadly accepted that with the overturning of Roe v. Wade and some thinking, oh no, what if the Supreme Court overturns its 2015 decision about same-sex quote-unquote marriage? The concern is, the political positioning you'll see from some that would have fought against it in 2015 are like, no, don't worry, we'll protect that. Hey, don't worry. Hey, I've got homosexual friends too, here and there. And I think you've seen, well, if you look at all the surveys, there's quite a broad turning of acceptance of some of those things. Mr. Weston often refers to that book After the Ball and how that laid out the strategy to have these things broadly accepted, and they are. But our young listeners in the Church of God, we can't be amongst those that approve those things. It does not mean hating people all the more. It means loving them all the more, because they are suffering under an ideology that will cause sorrow, will cause harm. It's a matter of actually loving them and wishing they could have a walk that is closer with God in truth and is not actually caught up in all these things. So no, we are not talking about hating people in any way whatsoever, but loving someone doesn't mean embracing all the terrible things they're caught up in.
No.
If anything, it means grieving those things.
Well, so I know we're wrapping up here, and so this is really one of my final thoughts. Something you said in there really reminded me of this, and since I gave some praise to Ben Shapiro, here's an area where I very strongly disagree with him, and that is culturally. He really does. I've heard him articulate it a number of times. He has this belief that if you want to live on the edge of town and be a practicing homosexual and get strung out on heroin, that's your business. You can do whatever you want. What's the political? Not Republican or conservative.
Yeah, I was going to say
libertarian.
Libertarian.
He's really libertarian, and I think and what's so funny is, as a somewhat Orthodox Jew and knowledgeable in the Old Testament, I'm surprised he's so dismissive of the numerous scriptures that talk about the sin that affects the entire community sins. You talked about that earlier. In fact, maybe we could talk about stoning sometime, because that's super controversial. And why does God have that? I think we have a pretty good answer for what the implications of stoning were. It was the community coming together to recognize that we're ending a sin that's so bad it would eventually infect the rest of the community over time. And to this idea that you can go off and live in a promiscuous lifestyle or at least not a godly lifestyle over time, that doesn't affect the community, he's just wrong on that. It does. You can't be an individual and not have some effect on the community. I mean, I would argue that's actually the case there in Deuteronomy when Phinehas acts in righteous indignation. They had fallen into the error of Balaam, and some of the people had gone out and mixed with another group. And I only remember that he is a Simeonite, because it records that, comes in with a girl from another area, and they go to the tent, and it's just a sin. It says in the sight of Moses, and this was spreading. And Phinehas walked in and put an end to what was going on there, and was praised by God for it, because the community was starting to come undone by the actions of a few.
In general, this world, in fact, it's I'll use some archaic terminology. This world seeks to sell to all of us these things as alternate lifestyles. They used to call it an alternate lifestyle. That's kind of the old terminology. Now it's part of your core identity. It's what you were born to be, as opposed to just some lifestyle that you could pursue. And they press those things in such a way to try to make you feel as if you are a bigoted sinner for even not just not going down the path yourself, but disapproving that others go down that path. They shove our kids towards it. They shove us towards it. It's in our department stores, our retail stores. It's our government days off. Surely they're going to start to give us a day off, officially, like a bank holiday for one of these things, in the future. It's hard to imagine that they actually won't. If people are headed in that direction, well, that's where the schools are helping. If you were to declare to your school that I'm a boy, but I think I want to wear dresses and stuff. These days, there's machinery to help you do that, to hide it from your parents. And yet they're passing laws and regulations that if you want to talk to that person, help them say, no, let me help you embrace your identity as a boy. Let me help you embrace, what God made you to be. They're trying to make those things actually illegal.
Right.
And so,
well, because there's now that this has been going long enough that there are people that went through transitioning and now are detransitioning, and they just want to tell everybody what a terrible mistake that was. But also, this is a common thing. They wish somebody had told them when they were younger a number of different things and said, you're never going to be a girl, if you're a boy in that case. And that you talk about gender affirming care. We should have some gender affirming care. It's an affirmation that you are in fact a boy if you're a boy.
That is one of the terrible redefinitions and Orwellian speak, for those of you who might have read 1984 and George Orwell, is the idea that the kind of quote unquote care they're giving people, one, that it's care at all. It's not care. And secondly, that it's gender affirming. No, it's gender denying. And you're right. You have these people saying, I wish they had actually described in more detail what my life is now like, because this is abhorrent. And I wish I hadn't have done this.
I mean, it really is the equivalent of, let's say I have some kind of psychological problem and I go into a clinical psychologist to get some help because I know this isn't a great thing. And they're like, no, that way of life is good. You should continue with your whatever the different thing. I don't even want to use something accidental. Right. Use an example, but I mean, it would be like clinical psychologists affirming care, and they come in for help, and you're just like, no, you're fine in all these terrible ways you're suffering in your life.
Yeah, and then even worse, though, in many places they're essentially trying to make it virtually illegal to advise them to go in the other direction. And so what's overall our message to all of you with this passage in Romans? It's to not fall for it. God defines righteousness and sin, right and wrong, good and evil. Going down some paths or even approving of those paths as if they're not actually harmful, it debases the mind, and frankly, it sounds dramatic, but it destroys civilizations. God wants us aiming higher and aiming at what He holds out. Embrace what God holds out to you. God's existence and what He offers and what He enlightens our minds to see is the only possible basis for truth and life.
Smith and Robinson.